On the night of August 16, 1951, a French baker named Léon Armunier was delivering bread when he suddenly felt the cobblestones beneath him begin to melt. He wasn't drunk. He hadn't taken any drugs. He had simply eaten his morning bread, the same bread hundreds of his neighbors had eaten, from the same local bakery that had served this quiet riverside town for generations. Within hours, Leon would be strapped to a hospital bed, screaming that serpents were crawling from his skin. He was one of over 250 people who collapsed into madness that night. 7 of them never woke up. For 50 years, the world accepted that explanation. Then a researcher named Hank Albarelli found a single declassified CIA memo, and the real explanation was so disturbing that several governments have refused to comment on it to this day. Pont-Saint-Esprit sits on the western bank of the Rhône River, about halfway between Lyon and Marseille. In 1951, it had roughly 4,000 residents. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where the boulangerie opened at 5 in the morning, and where the biggest news was usually the weekend market. The Rochebriand bakery on the Rue du Ministère was where most of the town bought their bread. On August 15th, a batch of flour arrived. The bakers did what they always did. By the morning of August 16th, the loaves were in the oven and on the shelves. By noon, the first patients appeared at the local medical clinic. Complaints of nausea, burning sensations in their hands and feet. Dr. Gabet, the town physician, assumed it was a summer stomach bug. By evening, he had 30 patients. By midnight, the hospital in Avignon, 30 miles away, was receiving emergency transfers. Patients were arriving with symptoms no doctor in the region had ever seen in combination before. They were vomiting uncontrollably, their limbs were seizing, their skin felt like it was on fire, and then the hallucinations began. One man was convinced he was being chased through the village by orange tigers. A young woman tried to jump from a second-floor window because she was certain she could fly. A retired schoolteacher tore out his own hair, insisting that flowers were growing from his scalp. And this was happening simultaneously, across an entire town, in hundreds of people. The French government moved quickly. Within days, investigators announced their conclusion. The town had suffered a case of ergotism, poisoning caused by the ergot fungus, Claviceps purpurea, which occasionally contaminates grain and produces powerful alkaloid compounds that can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and in severe cases, death. It was a condition known historically as St. Anthony's fire. In the Middle Ages, entire villages had been wiped out by contaminated rye. The symptoms matched. The bread was the common factor, case closed, except almost nothing else matched. Ergotism, in its classic form, primarily caused vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels, leading to gangrene of the extremities. Victims' limbs would blacken and die. That had happened in medieval outbreaks. In Pont-Saint-Esprit, there was almost no gangrene. What there was, overwhelmingly, was something closer to a mass LSD trip, vivid hallucinations, ego dissolution, paranoid psychosis, the sensation that the self had come apart at the seams. That form of ergotism, the purely psychedelic form, was extraordinarily rare in recorded medical history, and the concentration of symptoms required to produce that effect in 250 people simultaneously would have required levels of ergot contamination that should have made the grain visually obvious to any experienced miller. The miller examined the flour. The flour appeared normal. Several independent food scientists hired to analyze leftover bread samples noted that the contamination levels they found didn't fully account for the severity of what occurred. One French investigator wrote in his private notes that wouldn't surface until decades later, that the outbreak bore, quote, the characteristics of deliberate rather than accidental introduction. He buried that observation. He never included it in the official report. To understand what happened in Pont-Saint-Esprit, you need to understand what the CIA was doing in the summer of 1951, because what they were doing was almost unimaginable. The Cold War was barely 6 years old, but American intelligence had already become convinced that the Soviet Union had developed methods of chemical mind control. Korean War prisoners were returning with disturbing stories of ideological compliance they couldn't explain. The CIA was terrified. Their response was to launch a series of programs, initially called Project Artichoke, later expanding into the infamous MKUltra, whose purpose was the research and weaponization of substances capable of manipulating human behavior. The primary substance they were researching, a compound first synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD. By 1951, the CIA had already been in contact with Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland, the only manufacturer of LSD in the world at that time, and had secured large quantities of the drug for experimental purposes. And the key question they could not answer in a laboratory setting was this: what happens when you administer LSD to a large, unsuspecting civilian population in a real-world environment? Lab results on willing subjects told them about individual response. What they desperately needed to know was about mass response. How does a crowd behave? Can you destabilize an entire population? Can you make a town unable to organize resistance? The military application was obvious. If you could weaponize LSD, deliver it through a water supply, a food source, an aerosol, you could theoretically neutralize an enemy city without firing a single bullet. In 2009, an American investigative journalist named Hank Albarelli published a book called A Terrible Mistake: The Murder of Frank Olson and the CIA's Secret Cold War Experiments. Olson was a CIA biochemist who had been secretly dosed with LSD by his own colleagues in 1953 and died after falling, or being pushed, from a New York hotel window. That story had been partially told before, but buried inside Albarelli's decade of research was something far larger than one man's death. He had found a series of documents, some obtained through Freedom of Information requests, some through contacts within the intelligence community, that directly referenced Pont-Saint-Esprit. One document, from a CIA operative identified only by a code name, referenced a conversation with a Sandoz Pharmaceuticals representative. In that conversation, the Sandoz contact reportedly said that the Pont-Saint-Esprit incident was not caused by ergot fungus alone. The material was distributed. A second document, an internal White House memo from 1952, declassified decades later, referenced the Pont-Saint-Esprit incident as, quote, an experiment involving food supply contamination, and listed it alongside other artichoke operational activities. And a third source, a French government document that Albarelli obtained through European archival access, referenced an American presence in the region in August 1951, specifically individuals connected to the U.S. Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Fort Detrick was the beating heart of America's biological and chemical weapons program. In 1951, it was also the primary partner institution for the CIA's artichoke research. The question every skeptic asks is logistical. How would you actually get LSD into an entire town's bread supply without being detected? It sounds operationally impossible. LSD is colorless, odorless, and completely tasteless. An effective hallucinogenic dose, approximately 100 micrograms, is smaller than a grain of sand. It is invisible to the human eye and undetectable by smell or taste. A kilogram of pure LSD, about the size of a small bag of sugar, contains enough active material to dose 10 million people. In 1951, neither the French miller nor the French bakers had any way of knowing if their flour had been adulterated with a substance that had only been synthesized 13 years earlier and that virtually no civilian in the world had ever heard of. Albarelli's research suggested the most likely delivery method was the flour itself. Specifically, that a solution of LSD was introduced at the milling stage before the flour reached the bakery. The mill in Pont-Saint-Esprit had recently received a consignment of North African wheat. Albarelli found documentation suggesting that American operatives had access to the shipping chain at the port of Marseille, a city the CIA was heavily embedded in during this period due to ongoing operations against French communist labor unions. And here is the detail that makes the hair stand up. In 1951, the CIA was actively collaborating with Corsican organized crime networks in Marseille to break the power of communist-controlled dock unions. This is not conspiracy theory. It is documented history, confirmed by multiple declassified government reports and acknowledged by CIA historians. Those same networks controlled significant portions of Marseille's port infrastructure, including grain handling. The CIA already had the access. The CIA already had the substance. The CIA already had the motivation. It is easy, when discussing classified documents and chemical compounds in Cold War geopolitics, to lose sight of what actually happened to the people of Pont-Saint-Esprit on that August night. Léon Armunier, the bread delivery driver we mentioned at the opening, later described his experience in interviews. He said that the terror was not the hallucinations themselves. It was the absolute certainty that the hallucinations were real. He did not feel like he was imagining the serpents. He felt them on his skin. Charles Gravier was 67 years old. He had taught primary school in the village for 3 decades. On the night of August 16th, his family found him in his garden, attempting to dig up the ground with his bare hands because he was convinced that his house was about to be swallowed by the earth. He suffered a cardiac arrest during his psychotic episode. He was one of the 7 who died. Yves Laval was 11 years old. He had eaten a piece of bread at breakfast. By afternoon, he was catatonic. He spent 9 days in the hospital. His mother would later tell French journalists that for months after his recovery, he would wake screaming in the night, unable to explain what he had seen. 7 people died outright. Dozens suffered permanent psychological damage. Several were institutionalized for months or years. And every single one of them was told by their government that it was an accident, a natural disaster, a fungus in the grain that nobody could have prevented. They were never told about LSD. They were never told about the CIA. They were never told about artichoke. 2 years after Pont-Saint-Esprit, a man named Frank Olson fell, or was pushed, from the 10th floor of the Hotel Statler in New York City. Frank Olson was a senior biochemist at Fort Detrick. He worked directly on the CIA's artichoke program. He was one of the few people in the world who knew the full operational details of what had been tested, where, and on whom. 9 days before his death, Olson had been secretly dosed with LSD by his CIA supervisor, Sidney Gottlieb, without his knowledge or consent, at a retreat in rural Maryland. According to colleagues who spoke to Albarelli decades later, Olson had been having what they described as a crisis of conscience. He had been talking about what he knew, about experiments that had crossed lines he hadn't expected to cross when he'd taken the job. The official ruling in 1953 was suicide. The case was closed. In 1975, during the Church Committee investigations into CIA abuses, Olson's case was partially revealed. President Ford apologized to his family. The CIA claimed it had been a tragic accident, that the LSD dosing had been an unauthorized experiment that had simply gone wrong. Frank Olson's body was exhumed in 1994. Forensic pathologist James Starrs concluded that the physical evidence was more consistent with homicide than suicide. Olson had blunt force trauma to his skull that preceded the fall. He had been silenced. And here is the connection that closes the loop. Albarelli's research placed Frank Olson in Europe in the summer of 1951, not in France, but in the operational theater, working on artichoke. During the exact window when Pont-Saint-Esprit occurred, Olson knew what happened in that village, and within 2 years of showing signs that he might talk about it, he was dead. Cover-ups of this magnitude don't happen by accident. They require coordination, and the coordination around Pont-Saint-Esprit was multi-layered in a way that only becomes visible when you look at all the pieces simultaneously. The French government sealed the medical records. Every hospital report, every physician's case notes from August 1951 related to Pont-Saint-Esprit was classified under French national security provisions and removed from regional archives within weeks of the incident. This was not standard procedure for an ergotism outbreak. France had dealt with ergotism cases before. None of them had ever been classified. The official scientific paper published in the British Medical Journal in 1951, the paper that cemented the Ergot explanation in the scientific record for 50 years, was authored by 3 French physicians. Albarelli obtained correspondence suggesting that at least one of those authors had been advised by government contacts on which conclusions the paper should reach. The paper specifically and emphatically ruled out any other explanation. It was published within months of the incident, an extraordinarily fast turnaround for a peer-reviewed publication in 1951. At the Sandoz Pharmaceuticals level, documents obtained by Albarelli showed that company executives were contacted by CIA representatives in the weeks following the incident. The nature of those communications was never fully clarified in any declassified document, but the contact happened. And at the American government level, the relevant artichoke operational files from 1951 have never been fully declassified. As of today, the National Security Archive has confirmed that significant portions of 1951 artichoke operational records remain classified or have been administratively destroyed. Pont-Saint-Esprit today is a peaceful town. The Rhône still runs beside it. The market still operates on weekends. There is a small local museum that documents the 1951 incident, presenting it officially as a tragic case of ergotism. When Albarelli's book was published in 2009, French journalists traveled to the village to interview surviving witnesses and descendants of the original victims. The reaction was not disbelief, it was relief. Several elderly residents who had been children during the incident told journalists that their parents had always maintained, privately in family conversations, never for publication, that something was wrong with the official explanation, that the symptoms hadn't matched what the doctors were telling them. They had been right. They had simply had no way to prove it. The town's municipal council formally requested in 2010 that the French government open a new inquiry into the incident. That request was acknowledged. A response was promised. As of the time this script was researched, no new inquiry has been opened. No new official response has been issued. The Ergot explanation remains the official position of the French Republic. This is the part of the story that transforms Pont-Saint-Esprit from an isolated atrocity into something far more disturbing. Because the French village was not the only time. In September 1950, 1 year before Pont-Saint-Esprit, the U.S. Navy conducted Operation Sea Spray, releasing clouds of bacteria over the city of San Francisco to test how a biological agent would disperse over a civilian population. The residents of San Francisco were not told. 12 were hospitalized. 1 died. In 1953, the British government conducted similar experiments, releasing chemical compounds over residential streets in English cities, again without the knowledge or consent of the people being exposed. Between 1955 and 1965, the CIA ran Operation Midnight Climax, dosing unwitting Americans with LSD in safe houses in San Francisco and New York, filming their reactions through one-way mirrors. The program operated for a decade before being shut down. All of these programs were eventually exposed during the 1975 Church Committee hearings. CIA Director William Colby admitted to a pattern of unauthorized experimentation on civilians, but Pont-Saint-Esprit was never officially included in those admissions. It was never officially acknowledged. The French victims received no apology, no compensation, nothing. Let's be precise about what the declassified record actually establishes and what it doesn't, because this story is serious enough that it deserves precision. What is confirmed by declassified documents? The CIA was actively conducting artichoke operations in Europe in 1951. The CIA had large quantities of LSD obtained from Sandoz. The CIA was explicitly researching mass population delivery of psychochemical compounds. Fort Detrick personnel were involved in European operations during this period. What Albarelli's documents suggest but cannot definitively prove, that CIA or Fort Detrick personnel were physically involved in introducing a substance into the Pont-Saint-Esprit food supply, that the Sandoz Pharmaceuticals contact directly confirmed LSD involvement, that Frank Olson's presence in Europe in 1951 was specifically connected to the Pont-Saint-Esprit operation. What remains unknown? The full chain of command. Who gave the specific operational order, whether the French government knew and covered it up willingly, or was it self-deceived? The gap between confirmed and unconfirmed exists because the key documents remain classified or destroyed. That gap is itself evidence of something. Innocent governments do not classify ergot outbreaks for 70 years. Here is what you are left with when you assemble everything in this story. In 1951, the United States government was so consumed by Cold War fear, so convinced that the Soviet Union was developing weapons of mass psychological manipulation, that it authorized programs whose operating assumption was that American civilians, European civilians, any civilians, were acceptable experimental subjects without their knowledge or consent. This was not the action of rogue operatives going outside their authority. The Church Committee established that MKUltra and its predecessor programs were authorized at the highest levels of the CIA, with knowledge extending into the executive branch. The people who authorized these programs believed they were protecting the free world. That is the most disturbing part. They were not cartoon villains. They were people who had decided that the ends, maintaining American advantage in the Cold War, justified means that no democratic society could ever publicly sanction, which is why those means remained classified, and which is why, 73 years later, a small town on the Rhone River in southern France has still never received a straight answer about the night their bread made them lose their minds. 7 people died in that village. They died confused, terrified, and convinced that reality had come apart around them. Their families were told it was a fungus. Their medical records were classified. The men who may have ordered their deaths were never charged, never named, never held to account. And when a journalist finally assembled the evidence 58 years later, the governments involved declined to comment. No comment. The Ergot explanation remains the official position. The thumbnail you clicked on made a promise. That promise was this: that an entire village was poisoned, not by accident, not by nature, but by deliberate human decision. Here is what the full weight of the evidence suggests happened on August 15th and 16th, 1951 in Pont-Saint-Esprit, France. A consignment of flour, possibly adulterated with LSD at the point of origin or during transit through Marseille, arrived at the local mill. It was processed. It was delivered to the Rochebriand bakery. The bread was baked and sold. The people of the town ate it. What followed was the largest known covert LSD experiment ever conducted on an unsuspecting civilian population. The symptoms: overwhelming hallucinations, psychotic breaks, paranoid episodes, no significant gangrene, no typical ergotism vascular effects, match LSD poisoning far more precisely than ergot contamination alone. The declassified documents place CIA and Fort Detrick operatives in the operational theater. The sourced conversations reference the distribution of drug material. The cover-up was immediate, coordinated, and executed with resources that only a government could bring to bear. And the man who may have known the most specific operational details, Frank Olson, was dead within 2 years, his skull-bearing injuries inconsistent with a simple fall. 7 people in Pont-Saint-Esprit died in August 1951. No one has ever been charged in connection with their deaths. The Ergot explanation remains official. The artichoke files remain classified or destroyed. The French government has not opened a new inquiry. The American government has not commented. They poisoned a village, and then they buried the truth beneath a stamp that said classified. And for 73 years it stayed buried. Some of it still is. If this story raised more questions than it answered, that's because the full answers are still locked away in a filing cabinet somewhere in Langley, Virginia, or have been fed through a shredder decades ago. The next video covers another program from the same era, one that makes artichoke look like a rehearsal, and includes documents that were only declassified in 2017. That one is already in your recommended feed. The truth doesn't disappear just because someone stamps it secret. It waits.